Welcome to the 6th episode of the Socialist Rifle Association podcast. This is your host, AlexHumva, and we'll start off today with just a few things about the organization. Things are pretty quiet right now. We continue to add more chapters, however. We have about 12 chapters with social media accounts now, so that's continuing along pretty good. Membership continues to grow by the day, so as that happens, more and more will band together and become recognized chapters and start doing events with their comrades in the area, which will be pretty good. Also, the online shop will be coming online by the end of this week, I'm told. That will be a place to purchase stickers, buttons, patches, all kinds of different little SRA type merchandise. From what I understand, these are going to be priced pretty well, pretty reasonably. Pretty much everything we have right now is in-house, so you don't have to worry about it being produced in bulk in some awful sweatshop somewhere. Otherwise, things continue to be pretty steady, so we'll go ahead and transition right into some follow-up. In the last episode, we discussed how Saudi Arabia and Canada have had a diplomatic fallout after the Canadian foreign minister went on Twitter to say that maybe Saudi Arabia should stop arresting and locking up its social activists. Saudi Arabia did not respond well to this at all and proceeded to expel the Canadian diplomats present in the country as well as recall their own diplomats from Canada. Well, they upped their game this past week as a Twitter account that is run by the government. It is public knowledge that this is a government Twitter account. They have since tried to walk back from that after this incident, but it's confirmed to be a government Twitter account. They're trying to say it's an NGO, but it's not. It's public knowledge that this is run in some fashion by the Saudi Arabian government, one of their various divisions within their government. The Twitter account in question, infographic_KSA, posted a photoshopped image of an airliner flying into the Toronto skyline, apparently on a trajectory to the CN Tower. Now, this would be pretty questionable by itself, but then it also included the following quotes: "Sticking one's nose in where it doesn't belong," as well as "He who interferes with what doesn't concern him finds what doesn't please him," end quote. Now, the imagery of a airplane, a jetliner, flying into a major landmark/skyscraper, with the somewhat threatening quotes surrounding it, would seem to be a 9/11 reference. Now, I'm no expert, but I think that's pretty implicit. The Saudi Arabian government is insisting that it's just a picture of the airliner that the Canadian ambassador is returning home on. That's a cop-out and everyone knows it. It's fairly obvious from looking at the evidence in question that this is a very implicit 9/11 reference and pretty threatening, especially coming from such an official source. Why the Saudi Arabian government would do such a thing is just beyond us, beyond human comprehension perhaps. Or it could just be because they exist in a pretty totalitarian regime. They are a absolute monarchy where the monarch wields absolute power, except for the clergy, which is fairly powerful, but it's more of a feudal system in that respect, with a interface between the monarchy, the various lords or their equivalents thereof that exist there, and then the clergy, which exercises considerable influence. But the king still possesses, for the most part, absolute power, so long as he is acting within the bounds of the Quran. That is one caveat to his power. Point being, it's a totalitarian regime. When you live in such a society, sometimes things like this just come out a lot easier than they might in another society. But then again, who are we to talk? The U.S. currently has a very vocal individual on Twitter talking about national policy on Twitter at 2 o'clock in the morning. So maybe we don't throw stones in glass houses. But thankfully, as part of being a leftist, that means we can criticize everyone, because there's not a huge amount of leftist nations left in the world. On that topic, though, the New York Times posted an article about how the West shouldn't lecture Saudi Arabia about this. So I believe this article was written right before or right during the time where this picture was released. However, it's not really making reference to that. It's more making reference to the actual act of expulsion, of removing Canadian diplomats and cutting off diplomatic ties, as it were. Basically, the New York Times article in question is saying that the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman had no other choice. That due to the culture and the society of Saudi Arabia, if he had let such a slight from a foreign power go without consequence, that he would risk revolt within either his people or the nobles that prop his position up. It's worth noting the Crown Prince, while technically not in the position of king yet, does have a pretty strong de facto rule on the country, as his father has mostly stepped down from his position and is acting more in a ceremonial role right now. To help prop this up, the article then goes on to talk about the very limited reforms that have been passed in Saudi Arabia in the few years leading up to now. Things like allowing women to drive, allowing women to vote in municipal elections, a few things like that. It's worth noting that women have been able to drive in pretty much the entire world since the advent of the car. I'm not aware of too many nations where this right was restricted specifically to women, as by the 1920s, when the automobile was becoming affordable, most countries had gone ahead and done the whole women's suffrage thing. There were a few outliers, of course, but I'm not aware of too many countries that, especially to this day, prevent women from driving. It's just a very bizarre outlier Saudi Arabia has there. Also, the municipal elections in Saudi Arabia are mostly for show. The municipalities don't have much power at all. They do day-to-day business, but they are not in any way a federalist system where the local municipalities or provinces or states can exercise a lot of authority on their own. So allowing women to vote in that, well, important and great women's suffrage. I'm glad Saudi Arabia is getting with the times on that note, but it's also not a whole lot that is affected by it. So, they're giving essentially a symbolic thing out. It's not really anything practical. Also, the whole thing that sparked this off, the jailing of social activists, there are multiple women activists in Saudi Arabia that are being jailed, detained, arrested, whatever. They are being silenced because they are pointing out that Saudi Arabia still continues to be extremely regressive on the points of women's rights. They have literal religious police, folks. There are police out there that enforce religious doctrine, and they are a state-sanctioned thing. I don't say this to be negative against the people of Saudi Arabia, because, again, they are an absolute monarchy. Actions taken by the government cannot be reflective on the Saudi Arabian people, because it is an absolute monarchy with a very strong theocratic influence on it. It's also worth noting, while we discuss this, that the Saudi Arabian Air Force killed 40 children in Yemen in this past week. Those children were on a school bus, apparently, and the Saudi Arabian Air Force missile striked it. For those who are not aware, Saudi Arabia has been militarily involved in Yemen for the past couple years. This is something the U.S. has not only allowed, but continues to supply arms to Saudi Arabia for the war, despite the fact that Saudi Arabia continues to have horrible human rights abuses in the war, as well as just war crimes in general. It also continues to be aggressive with Qatar, its nearby neighbor, as it continues to have a trade war / embargo against the country. The United States mostly allows this to happen because we really need that oil. Oil is a powerful thing, unfortunately, and so we don't question these things as much. Despite evidence showing that the Saudi Arabian government was most likely involved in some capacity in the 9/11 attacks, the official U.S. findings continue to deny such a thing, despite the fact that the U.S. Congress passed into law overriding former President Obama's veto of it, a law that will allow American citizens to seek class action lawsuits against the Saudi Arabian government over 9/11. So the U.S. government refuses to acknowledge Saudi Arabian government involvement, but is letting U.S. citizens sue the government. But double standards are nothing new to the United States. So we'll round out this terrible segment by mentioning that Elon Musk, owner of many businesses, seller of many more, is attempting to get the Saudis to buy out Tesla. So Elon Musk, his company Tesla, producer of electric cars, is not doing so good right now. They're burning through money like nothing else, and as a result they're having difficulty finding investors. Also, because it is a public corporation, they are subject to certain SEC rules that make it harder for him to hide this fact. As a result, he's trying to take it private, and that would require a massive buyout of most of the Tesla stock. It's very hard to come up with the money. Last I checked, it was $70 billion that would be necessary. But the Saudi Arabians have a lot of money. Not as much as they used to, since oil prices continue to be low, historically speaking. But they have quite a few investment options that would allow them to buy a majority stake in Tesla if necessary. Right now, it waits to be seen whether or not this is going to be allowed by the SEC, whether the investors are going to allow it, and just how much Saudi Arabia intends to buy as far as a portion of the company. But after receiving some backlash from this, Musk has gone on Twitter to say that he is seeking different sources of funding, and that the Saudi Arabians are not the only source that he wants to be, that the Saudi Arabians are not the only source he has looked into. Moving away from Saudi Arabia and back to home, though, we have a bit of follow-up from the Portland protests. The Unite the Right to rally was held this week, commemorating the anniversary of Charlottesville. This ended up being much smaller than Charlottesville was, as compared to the hundreds if not thousands of fascists that showed up in Charlottesville to agitate and protest their supposed grievances. About 24 fascists showed up to this rally. Meanwhile, however, the counter-protesters showed up in force. I believe several thousand people showed up to be part of the counter-protest. Because there were very few fascists available to counter-protest, though, there ended up being various reports of agitation against the media and the police present. How much of this is true and how much of this is the media trumping things up because the media loves to trump things up? Who knows? I was reading an article about how a reporter had his phone swatted away from him by Antifa members. The story doesn't really hold water. The article claims that the journalist's iPhone was taken out of his hands and thrown across the street, but the phone survived with no damage. You know, I'm a Samsung guy myself. I have a Galaxy phone, so I'm not totally up to date on how durable iPhones are, but I can tell you, I'm pretty sure if somebody took your phone and tossed it across the street, it's probably going to be some damage, even with a good quality case. So I'm not really buying it. Now, the Antifa members were shown being very aggressive about their pictures being taken, but not physically aggressive against the reporter. People can get pretty agitated when you're trying to take pictures of them and probably go write a hit piece article about how terrible you are and how terrible the organization you're part of is. So I can understand being a little bit upset that you have a journalist shoving a camera in your face to try to get your pictures taken. So I'll be following this and see how much evidence comes up that can actually be corroborated, but I suspect, as usual, this is a case of the media just being disingenuous and looking for a bad guy, and since there were no fascists out there, they're gonna go against the anti-fascists and the counter-protesters, because in the liberal dichotomy, fascists and anti-fascists are the exact same thing. Though if we use that logic, then I guess you could fill your car up with water instead of antifreeze and it would work just the same. Except it wouldn't, because of course that's silly. In some new news, the best kind of news, we had a fiasco at DEFCON this year. So DEFCON is a yearly convention where a bunch of security-conscious hackers show up to do hackery things. This being the original use of hacker and not the Hollywood use of hacker. So anyone who's doing stuff with computers, basically, be it hardware side, software side, be it people delving into computer kernels or just writing applications. Basically any kind of computer modification, as it were. It's a very neat organization, very neat convention that they put on. It's not necessarily one ideology or another. You do attract a lot of libertarian types when going to it, but there are definitely leftist computer hackers out there that do attend. And in general, these people are pretty concerned with the idea of digital security, which is fairly important to everyone, including leftists. So every year they hold their convention in Las Vegas at the Caesar Palace Hotel. However, due to the events of last year and the Las Vegas mass shooting that happened, security has been tightened significantly in the city and its hotels. As a result, the people attending the DEFCON convention this year reported that the Caesar Palace staff were extremely rude and extremely aggressive when it came to security. Many confiscations were made. People were reporting their soldering irons being confiscated for whatever reason. I guess soldering irons are a deadly weapon now. So all sorts of searches and seizures being done by hotel security staff. One attendee reported that staff were violently beating on her door, demanding that she open the door. So she ended up having to call the hotel front desk and get a supervisor or someone to tell her whether or not, these men outside violently beating on her door are actually security or, violent men beating on her door. Certainly if I had somebody beating on my door and just demanding I open it up in a hotel, of all places, my first instinct would not be to open the door. We'll go ahead and say that. Multiple attendees have said that they weren't given any notice of this by DEFCON or the hotel. DEFCON itself says that they were not given any notice, though Caesar Palace insists that everyone was given notice. One of the main organizers and security people, Mark Rogers, did resign over the incident, though he did pen a letter saying that they had no idea. They had no idea about this. So I think this is a good reminder that whenever a major event happens, especially something as big and tragic as the Las Vegas mass shooting was, there can be a very strong pendulum effect where the pendulum just slings all the way to the other side. And this is definitely one of those instances that you have just this culture of paranoia and a lot of what's honestly security theater, because you're confiscating people's soldering irons. Are you really making the place more secure by doing that? The only thing that's going on is that they're doing this to make themselves look more secure. It's security theater is what it is. We also have some news out of Minnesota regarding Keith Ellison. So some people may remember Keith Ellison for his candidacy to be the DNC chairman. This was seen as a major progressive moment for the Democratic Party, especially given that he had the support of Bernie Sanders, and this was immediately after the fiasco that was the 2016 presidential race. However, despite being a self-proclaimed progressive Democrat, Keith Ellison has had some allegations come up against him recently from a woman named Karen Mullihan. She alleges physical and emotional abuse from Keith Ellison when they were in a relationship. Apparently her son witnessed some of this and has gone on the record talking about this. She also says she has a video, but does not wish to release it due to embarrassing content within that video. This is the second accusation of abuse made against Ellison. His first one was in 2006. He is again considered a very progressive Democrat for his views on healthcare and things like that, but is definitely still a very liberal Democrat. He has spoken against the Second Amendment and has essentially said in the past that if we could get rid of the Second Amendment, then he would. He has had a flirtation with leftist thought in the past, though, as he did sponsor a bill in Congress that would mandate that a third of a company's board of directors be elected by the workers, which is one of those things that sounds good on paper, but it's a third, so it's not even half. It would still allow 2/3 to be elected by the shareholders, and so it would end up being more symbolic than anything else and just be something to get you reelected rather than actually cause any change. The reason I bring this story up on the podcast is that in situations like these, we have to remember that rising stars within these parties and organizations and groups that claim to be progressive and claim to take all of these things very seriously, there's an unfortunate history of especially men that rise up in these organizations of still perpetuating the very things they talk about fighting against. And it is somewhat hypocritical within the Democratic Party that they have had many leaders with these problems and these allegations and things that are factually verified, empirically verified, either by society or by the court of law. Indeed, the most famous example of this would be perhaps Bill Clinton, who was quite the well-known womanizer and committed many misdeeds, we'll go ahead and say. It's pretty evident that he sexually harassed multiple women. But the Democratic Party gives him a pass because they need to get elected, is basically how that works. This has changed a bit in recent times, especially with the Me Too movement, but it's still a problem within the Democratic Party. And so I felt it good to bring it up on this podcast because this is something we have to be very vigilant about ourselves, because nothing hurts your credibility more than excusing the problems of your own just so that you can win. Winning is important, but the movement is hurt when people do hypocrisies like this. Elsewhere in the world, though, specifically to the south of us, here in America anyways, reforms in Cuba have begun. So Cuba is reforming its constitution. Its National Assembly have been deliberating on it. They now have a draft that they will be putting out to the people. It's already out there and will be deliberated on for the next several months until a popular vote can be conducted by the people. But in the meantime, it will be discussed in a variety of different local councils and groups for the people of Cuba to make suggestions on what modifications need to be made. The main reforms coming out of this, there's quite a bit. It's a very lengthy document, not one of those short constitutions. But the main takeaways from it is that it re-enshrines the socialist objectives of the Cuban society. It does remove mentions of advancing to communism. This has been taken out of context a lot in American media to be, they aren't going to be a communist nation anymore. When in actuality, these words mean a lot of different things. They're still very committed to the socialist system. It is their own variant of socialism, but they're still committed to it. It also adds protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. So it, in addition, legalizes same-sex marriage by making the definition of marriage between two persons. So, of course, this is a very positive moment for the LGBT community, which did see itself persecuted in Cuba during the 70s to 80s to 90s. There was a lot of persecution that went against the LGBT community during that time. The former leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro, did own up to that in recent times. He called it one of his greatest mistakes and issued a public apology about it, that he did admit his wrongdoing in those persecutions of the LGBT community. Time it was seen as a symbol of Western decadence and deviance, but times change, people evolve. Very tragic that happened during that time. It's also worth noting during that time that, other nations were doing the same thing. This isn't to try to excuse the actions of the Cuban government by saying, everyone else was doing it, but to say that people can't get on a moral high horse about it, because during the same time period, America was having the Stonewall riots. So it's good that the country is progressing and that this is going to be enshrined in their constitution, and that hopefully this closes that chapter of Cuban history and the country can move on from it. It also recognizes some changes regarding small businesses and private property. Foreign individuals can do some involvement in the Cuban economy now, but it will still be very heavily regulated. The Cuban economy will continue to be a primarily government-run endeavor. So some very moderate changes in that regard, but not much at all. Overall, I haven't seen too much to be concerned about or otherwise ecstatic about in the Cuban reforms, other than they're recognition of the LGBT community. That's something to be very positive and ecstatic about. But otherwise, it's a lot of clarification of various things that were in their previous constitution, made back in the 70s, I believe. So it's a good step forward for the country, I think. But there's not a whole lot to get crazy excited about or crazy upset about. We'll go ahead and round out this episode with a discussion about a little news piece I saw this week about socialism being on the rise in America. So a recent survey says that 51% of Americans aged 18 to 29 view socialism positively. The article in question cites a worsening economic situation here in America, which is definitely accurate. The American economy is a very strange beast right now. However, it's worth noting that the socialism on display here will not... I hate to do a no true Scotsman sort of thing, but this is one of those definitions that you just can't get around. Socialism is when the workers own the means of production. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I'll continue to say it into the future because people don't seem to be grasping this. I know I'm preaching to the choir a bit with my audience, but socialism is not Bernie Sanders. Socialism is not Alexandria Cortez. Socialism is not Scandinavia. And this is the problem. Americans think of the Scandinavian system, the European system, and think, that's socialistic. That's social democracy. Capitalism is still alive and well in Scandinavia and Europe and these places. There continues to be a market economy run by people who own property and where that ownership of property is limited to a few individuals. Now, I'm not here to say that the USSR is the only example of socialism, because no, my personal political beliefs don't even line up with that either. I'm more of a syndicalist sort of guy myself. But at least with the USSR, you can say that there was a genuine attempt at socialism. Now, of course, Marxist-Leninists will say that yes, that was a genuine attempt. Libertarian communists will say no, it wasn't. I'm not here to get into that debate. This is a big tent open mic sort of podcast. But you gotta, at the very least, have an attempt to have the workers run the economy, or possess the means of production, if you will. The European system does not do that. Bernie Sanders is not advocating that. Alexandria Cortez is not advocating that. They're advocating social democracy. They're advocating for a welfare state. So whether or not this is actually that a majority of young Americans believe in socialism as a positive thing, or if they're believing social democracy as a positive thing, who knows? But it's a good thing that it's in the popular discourse, I can say that. It's a lot easier to get somebody who is thinking about social democracy on the right track to thinking about socialism and leftism. And these reforms are good for workers. Having free healthcare, that's good for workers. I'm not here to say that's bad for workers, but it is ultimately only a patch on the system. Capitalism will continue to be exploitive regardless of how much welfare you toss on it. One of these days, in order to achieve true change, the workers must possess the means of production and must run the economy in a democratic fashion. Well, I'm going to go ahead and step off my soapbox there and call it an end to this episode. As always, I hope people enjoyed the episode. Leave your thoughts, comments, criticisms, and other ideas in the comments, wherever that might be. I always seek out responses to the podcast. I would like to take and incorporate any advice I'm given, because any creative endeavor needs a community to help guide it along. I am planning a very special episode, quote unquote, coming up here soon. There are some topics I've realized that I just can't do justice to in the short segments I do here on the podcast. There's many things I talk about that I still can't do full justice to. But in order to do complete justice to a topic, sometimes you need a lot of research and time. So it isn't always the best for a single episode where you've got multiple things being talked about. So as a result, I'm thinking of doing special episodes every now and then where a single topic can be discussed. My plan is to do a special full-length episode just talking about the Trump-Russia situation. So look for that coming out here soon. It's probably going to be off schedule. I might actually use it to bump my podcast schedule around. Wednesdays are somewhat difficult for me right now. I might move it back to Fridays like I was doing. So until next time, seize the means of production.